In this video, we'll be looking at the circulatory system, and in your textbook, you can find it on page 56. Now, the circulatory system is one of the systems that we'll be studying in life sciences from grade 10 to 12 in more detail. And in case you forgot, always remember, a system is a group of organs that work together to perform a specific function. Now, the circulatory system consists of the blood, the heart, and then the various blood vessels. And we are going to focus on the blood first. If we look at human blood under a microscope, it looks like red little particles flowing around in a white liquid. 1,000 times enlarged, these little red particles can be identified as red blood cells. They are flat, disc-like round cells dented in the middle, and they are called erythrocytes, or red blood cells most commonly. They are where the oxygen is carried. And as we slide along and we look all over under the microscope, we see that there's plenty of them. And here and there, we see a white cell that's perfectly round. And these are called white blood cells. So there we can see a few. So when a nurse draws blood from a patient's arm and puts it into a test tube, this is kind of what we have. Now, this test tube can be put into a machine called a centrifuge, and you can see in this machine how the test tubes nicely fit into this machine. If this machine is switched on, like in this video, it starts spinning around, and as the test tube spins, it separates the various contents inside the blood. Now, this is what the contents of the test tube looks like after it's been spun around in the centrifuge machine. The whole blood, which just looks like a liquid that is red, gets separated, and we actually see 3 layers here. At the bottom, we see the very dark layer consisting just of red blood cells. Then at the top, we see an almost yellowish straw-colored liquid called the plasma, and in between, there's a thin little layer called the buffy coat. In your textbook on page 57, each of these individual layers gets explained in more detail. At the bottom, we've got the red blood cells. The buffy coat consists of white blood cells and platelets. And then we have the watery part called the plasma right at the top. So let's look at these individually. So essentially, blood is extremely important because it transports oxygen and nutrients to all the cells of the body, keeping them alive. And every single part of the blood will play its specific part in this bigger function. Firstly, the plasma part is the liquid part of the blood. It mainly consists of water. It makes up about 55% of whole blood. Its function is to transport nutrients and waste products and other dissolved gases in a solution all over the body. Red blood cells, on the other hand, can also be called red blood corpuscles or even erythrocytes, as named earlier in the video. And these are large, flexible, disc-shaped cells with no nucleus. Makes up about 44% of whole blood. Red blood cells are formed in bone marrow, and they are responsible for transporting oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body. Red blood cells contain a molecule called hemoglobin, which will bond to that oxygen and hold onto it until it reaches the cells and then lets go and gives that oxygen to the cells. The next type of cells that we find in the plasma is called white blood cells. Now, they are much larger than red blood cells, but fewer in number. So only about 1% of your total blood volume consists of white blood cells. And on the right-hand side of this picture, you can actually see there's different types of white blood cells. Now, white blood cells fight diseases and infections, foreign particles that come into your blood. So depending on the type of infection or the type of germ that comes into your body, you have a different type of white blood cell to fight each of these different types of infections. The last constituent of blood that we find is called platelets. Now, platelets are smaller particles in the blood, not actually real cells, they're more like cell fragments. They're formed in the bone marrow and they play an important role in blood clotting. So you can see their odd shape on the right-hand side top picture now. But what happens with platelets is if they come together, they become sticky. They stick together, they form these little fibers which will trap red blood cells. So you can see here how a blood clot is formed by platelets sticking together and then adhering and pasting red blood cells together, protecting you from bleeding out of a wound or an open wound, and then a clot that is formed will actually have new tissue, new cells made underneath it to heal up that wound. Now, we already know that blood needs to reach every cell of the body so it can give it oxygen and nutrients. So how it gets there is through a system of tubes called blood vessels that are all originating or ending in the heart, which will pump the blood through the blood vessels. So let's look at the heart and the blood vessels in a little bit more detail. Whenever you look at a diagram like this, you'll see that the blood vessels are colored in red or blue. Now, in real life, obviously, the blood isn't red sometimes and blue in other parts. The only reason why it's done like this in a picture is to show you that the red blood is the areas where the blood is oxygenated, and the blue indicates blood that is deoxygenated. In other words, does not have a lot of oxygen in it. Blood travels around the body in 3 types of blood vessels, and the first one is the artery. Now, an artery is a blood vessel that transports blood away from the heart, and usually that blood is oxygenated. In this diagram, you can see the main artery leaving the heart is called the aorta. It's in red, which means there's oxygenated blood in it, and this blood will go all over the body to provide oxygen to each individual cell. The other artery visible on this diagram is the pulmonary artery, which is an artery transporting deoxygenated blood out of the heart towards the lungs. So obviously that's why it's in blue. This blood still needs to reach the lungs to receive oxygen. It's the only artery in the body that has deoxygenated blood. The second type of blood vessel we find are called veins. Now, veins carry blood towards the heart. Usually it's deoxygenated blood. Here we can see the pulmonary vein, which transports oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. Again, the pulmonary vein is the only vein that carries oxygenated blood. When we look at the circulation through the heart and the lungs and the body as a whole, like this picture, then you'll actually understand how it all works together. The red blood vessels on the right-hand side are obviously oxygenated. Now, from the heart, we have the main artery called the aorta that transports blood towards the whole body, every cell, in order for it to get oxygen. As the oxygenated blood reaches the organs and the tissues, that artery will split and divide into many, many smaller little, very tiny, thin little tubes, capillary tubes, blood vessels that are super, super thin, which we call the capillary network. Now, here is where the blood will lose its oxygen, gives its oxygen to the cells, and receives CO2 from the cells. So this is where gaseous exchange takes place. If we zoom in just on the capillary network, you can see that the red artery comes and subdivides into small little arterioles, then into the very, very tiny little capillaries where gaseous exchange takes place. And then the capillary network will join up again, forming venules and eventually veins. See how the color of the diagram changes from red, where the blood is oxygenated on the right, towards the vein on the left-hand side, which is deoxygenated blood, because the oxygen is lost in the capillary network. When we compare the arteries and the veins and the capillaries, we can clearly see arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. Usually it's oxygenated blood. Veins carry blood towards the heart, which is usually deoxygenated. And then capillaries is where the cells are supplied with oxygen and nutrients in between the cells.